So yes, I'm effectively a biomedical researcher, and what I want to do in this presentation is to give you some insight into how we understand from a scientific perspective what is happening to life expectancy. And of course, this has very powerful interconnections, as we've heard already, with what is happening in those parts of the science, actuarial science, demography, and the world of finance that has to cope with the changes that are occurring within our society. Before I leave this introductory slide, many of you will recognize the lady at the bottom right of this. This was Madame Jeanne Calment, who died in 1997 at the age of 122 years and 5 months. And she is really the annuity provider's nightmare. Some of you may know that she made a deal with a local solicitor, which was effectively a private annuity arrangement, and this poor man died before she did, and the debt was passed on to his descendants. So they ended up paying her a great deal of money. Okay, well, aging. It's very familiar to all of us. These are two images of the same guy. It happens to be the English painter, Augustus John. They're taken about 50 years apart. At the left is a young man at the prime of life, late 20s, looking very strong, fit, healthy. And then 50 years later, you see the same man not long before the time of his death. And of course, we can look at images like this and instantly, because we're so familiar with aging, we just look at the guy on the right and say, oh, it's an old man. We look at the guy on the left, we say it's a young man. Then if we try to identify the differences between the two men and what it is that 50 years has done, there's lots of things that we could list that are descriptive. And of course, if you could bring him into a clinic or a laboratory and look at the state of his cells and his internal organs, you would find that many, many changes have occurred. So this is a fundamental process. It's a part of biology. Aging occurs not just in human beings, but in many, many other animal species. And so from the perspective of science, what we're interested in doing is, sort of saying, well, what has happened to change the guy on the left into the guy on the right? And then there's a deeper question, which is quite important when we try to understand the constraints that operate on human biology, animal biology, and that is to understand why this has happened. And this is a question that really takes us into the realm of evolutionary biology, because actually it's quite important to understand where are the evolutionary origins of the aging process. What is the genetic architecture that produces the phenomenon of aging, and how might that architecture respond to some of the changes that are occurring today? Now, if we try to look at aging, it turns out aging is one of those things which is so familiar to us, but actually it's quite difficult to define. And the definition that most people use is the impact of aging on the age-specific mortality rate. And that's shown here for a typical high-income human society. Note that mortality is plotted on a logarithmic scale here. This is so that we can see, across the life course, the near linear increase in longevity when plotted with log mortality against age. And of course, this takes us back to one of the founding fathers of the science of, actuarialism, and also of the science of aging. And this, very interesting, this came together in a seminal paper published in 1825 by Benjamin Gompertz. And earlier this year, it was 350 years of scientific publishing. The first modern scientific journal was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London. And to commemorate 350 years of this journal, I was asked to write a review appraising the impact of Gompertz's paper published in this journal back in 1825 over this period of time. So if you're interested to see how these two stories interweave, you can look up that paper. We're all very familiar with what this slide shows. We can see, I'm not going to take time to dissect it. Early life is a time of some vulnerability. Death rates reduce to their minimum, which occurs in the early teens, around about the age of puberty. There's then a little upward blip, higher for males than for females, and sadly we know what causes this blip. It's mostly accidental deaths, some suicides, too many suicides in this number. I sometimes describe this as hormonally driven risk-taking behaviors that are associated with the transition from adolescence to adulthood. And then when you take those away, you have this underlying increase which goes up across the life course. And what is so striking about this is that it tells us right at the beginning that the aging process is not something that begins at 40 or 50 or 60 or whenever you start to think of a person becoming old, but the impact of aging on the mortality trajectory is something that begins while we're still children. And of course, mortality rates are higher at all ages for males than they are for females. I would quite happily give you a lecture on why that difference might exist, but I don't have the time now, so we can discuss it perhaps on the boat this evening if you're interested. But it's a very, very interesting question to address. Now, many of you, I hope by now, will know this, but out there in the wider world, there is a very widespread belief that aging is programmed into our biology, that there is something in our genomes that makes us age and die at a certain time. I find if I talk about this in a social context that 9 out of 10 people still believe that there is a genetic program for aging. And sadly, even within the field of science, probably about 5 out of 10 still believe this. And yet, we have been able to demonstrate over the last decades that nothing could be further from the truth. There are no genes that have evolved within our genome to make us age. And it's really important that we understand that. If you look in the natural world, and this is shown in the graph at the top right, what you see for natural animal populations is that the mortality pressure in the wild is very heavy. And it's very unusual for individual animals to survive long enough to exhibit any signs of aging. So number one, that means there's no need for natural selection to evolve programmed aging, as some have suggested, as a means of population control. Nor is there any real opportunity for natural selection to bring about the evolution of a genetic program, which is so seldom used. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this. I've written about this extensively over the years, and I can send you the arguments in full if you want them. But we have to abandon the idea that we are programmed to age and die, although genes are involved in the story, and I'll come to that later. Actually, the truth is that the body is programmed not for death, but for survival. And even in the last minutes of our lives, when that point comes, pretty well every organ system, every cellular system in your body is going to be doing its hardest to try to keep you alive. But the reason we die is that there was no evolutionary pressure to invest in a body that might live forever, because in earlier times, people just didn't live that long. And this is an idea that I put forward longer ago now than I care to remember in a paper in Nature back in 1977. And it's the underpinnings of a concept that's called the disposable soma theory. Let me just take a moment just to emphasize that in our bodies we have two broad types of cells. We have what are called the germ cells, the cells of the reproductive lineage. Those are the cells through which life is transmitted from one generation to the next. And the germline has to be, in a fundamental sense, immortal. Just stop and think for a moment. There is something quite amazing in this room today, in each of our bodies. And that is that the cells that make up the body, that walked into the room after the coffee break and sat down, contains about 100 million cells. Each one of those cells, if the records existed, could trace its presence here in this conference today through an unbroken chain of cell division that goes back 4 billion years to the emergence of the earliest cellular life on planet Earth. So in a sense, your bodies are in touch with immortality. And if you have kids, that chain will go on into the future through your children and grandchildren. But the reality is that most of your body is made up of somatic cells and tissues, and they are the ones that are destined to die. So it's a really important distinction. And sometimes, if life is getting too much, it's worth just reflecting that immortality that we are sort of a part of. Okay, so the logic of this then leads us to understand that aging is caused by the accumulation of damage. because we have excellent maintenance and repair systems, but not perfect. And so as we live our lives, we have an accumulation of random molecular damage that arises within all the cells of our bodies, and it accumulates gradually. So over the life course, we accumulate cellular defects, and in the case of a human being with our lifespan of around 100 years, over many decades, this builds up to result in the functional impairments in the organs and tissues that are associated with frailty, disability, and disease. Now, scientists in labs like mine have been studying the molecular mechanisms of intrinsic aging, and I know this is not a biological audience, so I'm not going to go into the detail of this. But one of the things that we're learning is that there are many different mechanisms that contribute to the accumulation of damage in the cells and tissues of our bodies. And some of these mechanisms operate more prominently in the dividing cells of the body. Those are cells like the cells of the skin, of the immune system, other organs where there is continual cellular replacement. And some of the mechanisms are more characteristic of what are called the post-mitotic cells. Those are cells that divided to form your body, but once the organ is formed, as in your brain, the cells do not really divide again. Arguments about whether we have neuronal stem cells that might replace a few cells, but basically those cells do not divide. And cells that do not divide have their own particular kinds of problems. They have garbage disposal problems because all the junk, all the molecular crap that builds up each day of our lives accumulates in those cells, and it's quite difficult to get rid of it, whereas a dividing cell just shares it out between two daughter cells, so it's automatically halved with every division. So these sorts of things are important. And what we're learning now, and one of the most exciting things of the science of the last decades, is that we're beginning at long last to get away from the idea that you have to have champions fighting for individual theories of aging. The field of aging research used to be a little bit like a school playground, where you had a lot of gangs, and you'd have people who would run around waving the flag for the telomere theory of aging, or waving the flag for the mitochondrial theory of aging. And I think what we now understand, and this is informed by the evolutionary logic, is that it no longer makes sense to think of it being this mechanism or that mechanism or the other mechanism. We know it's this mechanism and that mechanism and the other mechanism. And they work together in complex networked processes that give rise to the changes of aging. These are processes we're beginning to understand. This is greatly aided by the new technologies in science. This is a confocal microscope image. It's a static image. Obviously, I'm not showing you a movie here. But what this allows you to do is to visualize the damage that exists within, in this case, an old cell. So the dark oval in the middle is the nucleus of the cell. And you can actually visualize in a single cell through these microscopic techniques the DNA damage that is a part of the aging process. And in the rest of the cell here, what's called the cytoplasm, this is highlighting the mitochondria, the little energy-forming units. And all you need to appreciate the trouble that this cell is experiencing life is to know that as far as mitochondria are concerned in this image, green is bad, red is good. There are not many red mitochondria. So, the cell is having difficulty producing the energy it requires for functioning. And so as we get older, if we try to hurry for the bus, or if we try to engage our brain, the brain is an energy-hungry organ working on a hard problem, we will get there in the end because the brain retains its power, but it may take a little bit longer. And this is the reality of the physical processes of aging. Now, you can do this with live cell imaging, and then you can visualize in real time these lesions arising. And it's quite important to understand the dynamic, the kinetic nature of the aging process. So again, here we all are in the room. I'm standing, you're sitting quietly. You probably think your body is at peace. But nothing could be further from the truth, because every second that you're sitting there, your DNA is being attacked and your proteins are being attacked by all kinds of destructive agents that are simply the byproducts of the chemistry of life. So if we could hear the noise of that attack, it would be a deafening cacophony of sound. And at the same time, while the armies of damaging agents. The dark side of life is at work damaging your cells. You've got armies of repair enzymes, the good guys, who are running around like crazy trying to put everything back together again. The reason you'll age is that although those good guys are really, really good, and they will put back 999 out of every 1,000 lesions, at the end of 24 hours, there will be 1 or 2 that they've missed. And that accumulates. So tomorrow you begin the day with a few more elements of damage in your body, and a few more, and a few more, and it goes on. So now we're beginning to understand that, the way we age, the way age-related diseases come to being is because we accumulate damage that starts early in life, it builds up in tissues, eventually it results in what we can call the end-stage pathology of age-related diseases, like the plaques and tangles in an Alzheimer brain. And we need to understand that to make change, we have to work upstream in these processes. And what's exciting about that is that as we work upstream from individual age-related diseases, we find that there's some commonality of underlying pathways that are shared by different diseases. And actually, the relationship between intrinsic aging and age-related diseases is one of the most exciting frontiers in the life sciences. Doctors tend to look at the body in terms of diseases. Often biogerontologists try to look at it in terms of healthy aging. And the dialogue we need to generate between these two perspectives is potentially very important. Now, this leads me to something which I excluded from that earlier diagram where I showed the nature of the aging process, random molecular damage giving rise to cellular defects, giving rise to frailty, disability, disease. And one of the striking things that we've realized is that this is a process which is not operating sort of in isolation from the way we live our lives, but that these processes interact with much that is happening in the rest of our lives. So we're learning that some of the adverse factors in life, the wrong kinds of stress, living in poor environments. This connects to what we heard just before coffee about socioeconomic differences. And we know that there is this pronounced social gradient in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy that comes from many factors in the environments of people who are economically disadvantaged. We know about poor nutrition. We know that if you eat a diet that's got too much sugar in it, too much saturated fat, it doesn't just make you overweight. It doesn't just make you unfit in a sort of athletic sense. It actually contributes to the core processes of molecular damage that are a part of the intrinsic biology of aging. And the healthy lifestyle, healthy nutrition, good nutrition empowers the body's protective armies of repair systems. Physical activity, very interesting, physical activity is damaging. If you go for a run or you go to the gym, you will damage the muscles and joints of your body. But you end up better off because that kind of damage that happens through natural processes stimulates the body's repair systems to work at a higher level than they would have done otherwise. So at the end of the day, when you're starting to recover from the damage you've done through exercise, you end up better off in terms of accumulated damage than you would be otherwise. What we're also learning, and this is incredibly important in terms of trying to understand where longevity may go into the future, is the really important impacts of inflammation. Now, inflammation exists in our bodies. It evolved as a capacity to respond to emergency. That's what inflammation is about. It's about wounding. It's about infection. It's about the bad things. It's about a burn or sort of the bad things that can happen to the body. And inflammation was there to do its job, to upregulate everything, and then to be closed down again. But what is happening now is that as we live our lives, damage itself causes inflammatory reactions. So the damage that is part of the aging process is generating inflammatory processes. We're beginning to learn, my colleagues in Newcastle published a very interesting study with some Japanese from Keio University recently, showing that supercentenarians, people who live for a very long time, actually are endowed with sort of quite well protected systems against the adverse consequences of inflammation. So inflammation is an important part of this emerging story. And the important thing is that, what we are seeing now with the current increase in life expectancy is coming about because of the intrinsic malleability of the aging process. Just think what has driven the increase in life expectancy over the last 200 years. Well, for the first 150 years of that 200 years, life expectancy was driven by one thing only, and that was by reducing deaths in the early and middle years of life. Preventable deaths, mostly caused by infections, but other things associated with lack of hygiene and so on. By the time we got through into the last half of the 20th century, we had controlled mortality in the early and middle years of life to such a great extent that the room for further mortality improvement by further reducing the old targets of death rates in the early and middle years of life had almost completely disappeared. And that's why if you look back at the forecasts from all the big agencies in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, they were predicting that life expectancy would hit a ceiling and stop increasing. And that's because they were in the mindset of thinking the aging process was a biological given, was fixed, probably programmed, though no one had really got into that. What has happened and become very clear in the last 40 or 50 years is this increasing life expectancy, and this is driven by something unforeseen and new to medical science, and this is the rapidly reducing death rates of people who are very old already. So the current increase in longevity, as you, I'm sure, all well know, is driven by the declines in mortality that are occurring in people who are already old. Not so much the young ones, and hardly at all the young ones. And this is proof from the demographic standpoint of the malleability of aging, and it meshes with what we're learning from the molecular science, the cellular science. So what we need to do in this new world where life expectancy is continuing to increase is to try to understand, sort of what is driving this. And we could write a list of factors that we think influence health trajectory in old age. And we can put down, sort of the usual suspects, if you remember the movie Casablanca. So genes, nutrition, lifestyle, environment, socioeconomic status, psychology, attitude, and so on. And people have spent a lot of time and quite a lot of money recently looking at genes. I've been involved in some of the biggest of these studies, European concerted action programs, that have been investigating the genetics of aging. We know from the wonderful records kept in the Scandinavian countries, we can actually estimate the heritability of human lifespan because they have this amazing sort of data available, and from that we know that genes account for about 25% of what determines human longevity. So it's only a quarter, but a quarter is a significant chunk. So over the last 10, 15 years, people have invested many millions of euros, dollars, in trying to find the genetic factors that make up this 20%. As I say, I've been one of the leading investigators in a big study that has spent 15 million euros and used many thousands of investigator months. And if you look at the publications that come out of it, it's incredibly disappointing because these studies have found almost nothing. And the reason they've found almost nothing is that there are no big hits. The relevant genes, there are lots of them. There are hundreds of them. And they mostly have very small individual effect, which makes them extremely difficult to identify. But where we do get a hint of what they're doing, we know that they mostly influence metabolism and somatic maintenance, the kinds of processes that I've spoken to you about before. So genetics is interesting. It's a frustrating, difficult story, and we shouldn't hold our breaths waiting for any real contribution to being able to extend human health span from the studies on genetics. But we can be optimistic too. So nearly 10 years ago in Newcastle, I started a very big study, the Newcastle 85+ study, which was motivated by the almost complete absence of detailed information on what life was like for people aged 85 and older. So the Newcastle 85+ study at its launch became the largest and most detailed investigation of what life was actually like for 85+-year-olds anywhere in the world. And now there are 3 or 4 studies, and we form a consortium doing this in New Zealand, in Japan, in the Netherlands, in Israel and other places. So we're beginning to sort of get information. And in our study in Newcastle, this was done by the beauty of doing research within European systems where you have national health frameworks is that when you get the funding and the ethical approval, you can approach your subjects with great ease. So when we'd got the money, what we wanted to do was to approach everyone. absolutely everyone in Newcastle who had been born in the year 1921. So, you just go to the National Health Service and say, okay, here's my certificate of approval. Give me the names and addresses and the family doctors of everyone. So we went to them and we tried everyone. We sought to recruit the people with dementia, the people in care homes, everyone. We didn't want any exclusions. And we had worked very hard to prepare for this with a fabulous team of research nurses. And as a result, we achieved really spectacularly high recruitment rates into the study and then retention during the successive monitoring of the people over the study. And this has now produced one of the largest data sets, sort of its kind. And it's open for people who want to collaborate. I'm not going to be able to show you the details of this, but I just want to pick out a couple of highlights from this. First of all, it becomes very clear that multimorbidity is the norm in people aged 85 and above. So using assessments we made directly on people, but also using their GP records, we could determine for each person whether they had or did not have each of 18 different age-related conditions. So everybody gets a score which could be between 0 and 18. 0 if they were completely healthy, 18 if they had the lot. You can see the histogram here. And sadly, out of the more than 1,000 people recruited into the study, no one had nothing wrong with them at 85. 75% of people had 4 or more age-related diseases. So we need to recognize that we're entering a landscape where medicine has to be configured completely differently because of the pervasive presence of multimorbidity. But what was also very interesting when we asked people to self-rate their health and quality of life was that 78% of them, that's nearly 4 out of every 5, self-rated their health and quality of life in spite of all the illnesses they had as being good, very good, or excellent. So we're entering a world where people have a lot of illnesses, but the illnesses are reasonably well managed. Of course, not everyone answered good, very good, or excellent. 22% didn't. And we know that for many people, being very old and having some of these illnesses is misery. So it's a very diverse spectrum, but it's more positive than you might expect. We did a similar thing for activities of daily living to get an assessment of disability. 17 different activities of daily living, the scores are here. What we hadn't expected, and were very surprised, delighted, encouraged to find, was that 1/4 of men and 1/6 of women had no functional limitation at age 85. They could do it all, which was astonishing. Again, extraordinary diversity. Some people really requiring intense care 24/7. But it gives the data, and we need the data. This informs sort of the planning and provision. What it also shows, which is interesting, is that women, despite living longer than men, experience more ill health, more years of compromised health, and more disabilities at the ends of their long lives. So there's something that's well recognized within the sort of the medical, epidemiological, demographic circles is the survival disability paradox. It's very interesting to try to identify what are the underlying biological factors, but I haven't time to go into that now. So one of the things that is really, really important, and this is an area where the biology intersects with things like the life insurance industry, the sort of annuity planning and everything, is, can we relate health status to intrinsic markers of biological age? People have been trying to do this for many, many years, and success would be, sort of very enabling. We could debate whether we wanted to use the data in these ways, but it could be of great value to the pensions and life insurance for risk assessment. Most particularly, it will be essential to assess interventions to improve health span in the later years of life. You don't want to trial an intervention in a trial that will take 20 or 30 years before you know the outcome. You want to be able to see whether your intervention is making a difference without waiting for the final result. And you can only do that if you can measure what the intervention is doing to aging. And also, in a world where people are personalizing their lives a lot more and they're trying to take control of their lives, we can see that this could be greatly enabling for personalized monitoring of age-related health trajectories. I was at a very interesting meeting in Zurich last week, which was specifically discussing how these kinds of technologies could be enabled and empowered. So on Monday this week, or maybe, well, it was over the weekend, I think, actually, we're Tuesday today, aren't we? But yesterday within the UK, the media were full of stories relating to this paper just published in Genome Biology. And I'm sure in other national medias they probably will be. This is a paper, obviously the people at the University of King's College London had a very good press office because they managed to put out a press release that garnered a great deal of attention. It's oversold. There's no question that this is exaggerated in terms of the potential that it can deliver. Nevertheless, it's an important advance in terms of being able to do this. So I'm not going to go into the details of what this paper is claiming, but over the first half of this year, we've seen quite a number of publications claiming to be able to measure biological age. So this is something which is evolving and moving. And we in the Newcastle 85+ study have measured a very wide range of biomarkers in our 85-year-olds. And we published a paper 4 years ago showing the association of all the kinds of things that we could measure on the slide here with the trajectories of health that individuals followed. And what we were interested to do was to see, because individual markers are not terribly informative, is whether we could develop composites. So we developed an approach called a Frailty Index in collaboration with a group at Dalhousie University in Canada. And just a couple of months ago, we published a paper where we created a Frailty Index based on biomarkers to predict mortality over the 7 years of follow-up within the study. And what you can see, you can go to the paper for the detail, is that this Frailty Index gives quite good predictive capacity to work out who has the better or the poorer chance of survival from the entry point in this, which was at age 85, over the subsequent period of follow-up. So although we can measure we can't measure it precisely, we can see that there are biological factors that relate to increasing frailty and mortality. And I think it's important that we, when we bring our disciplines together, as we're doing at this meeting, that we build on these kinds of beginnings. Can we relate this to the malleability of the aging process? For example, with an increase in life expectancy of, say, 2 to 2.5 years a decade, do biomarkers show changes later? We would predict that they should. Do diseases develop later? We would predict they should. Do we see compression of morbidity? We don't know whether we should or not, but it would be nice to be able to study it. So there are not many examples where people have yet been able to address these questions, and yet we desperately need to do so. Just recently, well, a couple of years ago, there was a very nice study published looking at dementia. Some years back in the late 80s, early 90s, the Medical Research Council in Britain funded a study, the Cognitive Function and Aging Study, which it was a multi-center study, and it looked at the prevalence of dementia and cognitive impairment. And then between 2008 and 2011, the study was repeated. So, sort of a couple of decades later, really. And if you use the age and sex-specific prevalence figures from CFAS-1, you would predict that 8.3 of the studied population in CFAS-2 would have dementia. But the actual level of dementia that was found was only 6.5. So that is very encouraging because it suggests that over the 2 decades, that the age-specific risk of being demented has reduced quite significantly, even though the overall numbers have grown because there are more old people around. So this is the kind of thing we need to see more of. So what we need to do to get to grips with these changes is that monitoring is problematic, and we really need to commit the energy and resource to do this. One of the major difficulties, and within Europe there are big efforts to try and do this, Jean-Marie Robin, who will be speaking, I think, tomorrow, has been involved in some of this work. Harmonization of health measures is important. There have been some important steps forward. The Global Burden of Disease program, I think, has made a valuable contribution. And what we're seeing is that the data show evidence of regional variability. So in some countries, there appears to be compression of morbidity in the later years of life, while in other countries there isn't. Now, is this a measurement problem? Is it a real underlying problem? If it is, why? How do we make progress? I think, just to bring things back, this is a really striking picture. If we apply the death rates from the Registrar General of England and Wales for the year 1900 to a cohort, we get survival across this. I apologize to all the actuaries, demographers, people who know how to do this so much better than me. This is my crude attempt to do this, just using raw data from the Registrar General. But the arrows show a cohort making its way through life and dying away. And the pink arrows show what happened for a cohort born 100 years later. So the pink bits you can see here are the people who are now living who would in previous generations be dead. And this is just an extraordinary transformation within our society. So, you know, we need to identify the factors contributing to malleability of longevity and health in old age. We need to understand multimorbidity. We need to think how we can use this knowledge. But most importantly, you know, and we had a member of the French government here earlier, we need to think how we can set in place the mechanisms that we will need to track incidence of age-related diseases. I showed you what the CFAS-2 study made possible because 20 years previously, someone had done CFAS-1. But if CFAS-1 had not been done, we would not be able to make that comparison. And this is why, you know, sort of the industry and society needs to be setting these measures in place. And why are we not doing it? Well, there are all kinds of reasons, some of which I've listed here. These are fundamental barriers to progress: fatalism, prejudice, reluctance to recognize the complexity. People are very blinkered in their vision, short-termism, and funding constraints. All of these are problems, and it will require the combined energy and forcefulness of communities like ours to overcome these. So I've probably spoken longer than I said I was going to, but thank you very much for listening to me.
So you've said that the communities from biogerontology could open angles. How do you think that the advances in, you know, there is some gene therapy being performed in people in a few countries now with respect to some presumably longevity gene therapy. We don't know whether it will work or not. There are some people who are grafting new thymus to have better immune systems in aged persons. So there are some beginnings of things, a little like we've seen with Louis Pasteur, who had tested on himself. So some people believe that they have the solutions, or some solutions, of course, for better health. And there is also, of course, the big Google or Human Longevity Inc. So we don't know whether this will work or not. And how do you think this should be presented to the world of actuaries? Because it's a different world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting, very important question, very big question. I mean, the first thing to say is that there is no intervention that has been proven to extend human longevity or human health span. And it will be quite a long time, given the time lag in these processes, before that becomes available. You mentioned a few things that people are working on. Gene therapy, I think, is completely it's way, way over the horizon. You know, I mean, if you think in terms of gene therapy, we cannot yet achieve the so much simpler task with gene therapy of simply fixing inherited genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. You know, when we've been able to treat what are childishly simple targets like that, where we've got a gene, we know all about the gene, we know the gene is broken, we know whether we want the gene expressed, we've got vector systems that should be able to deliver the gene in functional form to the relevant target tissues. You know, when we've been able to treat cystic fibrosis, then we can maybe begin to think about gene therapy for aging. But remember what I said about the difficulty of identifying genetic factors associated with human longevity. So, you know, we don't know how to do gene therapy. We don't know what we want to target with gene therapies. We have hypotheses, but we don't know. Can you do cell rejuvenation techniques using stem cells, using transplanted thymus and so on? Possibly, because, you know, some age-related diseases are because organs run out of viable cells. You know, so the great hopes might be transplanting to repopulate the immune system in older people, or with Parkinson's disease, transplanting the necessary cells into the brain of a person who has lost these. In theory, you know, could be done. Hasn't been done yet. In some cases, you know, it might be getting near to being done. This is a sort of patchwork repair of the body. It's rather like taking an old car, looking at the bit that's failed and going to the shop for a new part, or going to a scrapyard for an old part to replace it. You know, Google, Calico, well, interesting. let's kind of watch this space, but let's also be prepared to be very, very patient. Because, you know, I have great respect for many of my colleagues who have joined these kind of enterprises, but actually the science is really complicated. And I don't know if Alex is here. I was talking to Alex, you know, so he and I share an interest in understanding the biomolecular networks that regulate some of the processes that we believe to be involved in longevity. You know, I should really say my colleagues and I play only a small part in that these days, you know, develop complicated, sophisticated models of the interaction of these molecular pathways. We can use these pathways to explore in silico where might be the nodes of maximum gain if you try to make an intervention. And I think this is exciting science, but it's still a long, long way from application. So the answer to your question is, you know, I'm an optimist, and it sometimes makes me really cross that people who spin these stories about what may happen in the future make me look like the world's greatest pessimist. But I think I'm being realistic, because my reasoning about the timescale for bringing about these advances is really based on detailed consideration of the fundamental mechanisms that are involved. So it's a sort of half and half answer.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer and for your talk.